Bjorn Benson rocks a fly mullet. Louisa Kim is as open as she appears. And humans are ugly, giant bags of mostly water. Fact. Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Seventh Rule with Cirroc, Lofton, and Denise Crosby.
Hello.
My name is Ryan T. Husk. Today we're doing a review of Star Trek The Next Generation, Season 1, Episode 17, entitled Home Soil. Story by Carl Gers, Ralph Sanchez, and Robert Sabaroff. Teleplay by Robert Sabaroff and directed by Corey Allen. This was February 20th, 1988. We have a very special guest for everybody today. He's an evolutionary biologist, what a coincidence, vice provost for academic affairs at Duke University, and he's an occasional Star Trek science advisor. We'll find out if he advised on this particular episode. Special guest, Dr. Mohamed Noor. Hey, Mohamed.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you for having me on the show. And no, I did not advise on this when I was 17.
Well, you should have, okay?
You know, what a coincidence. There was actually a little bit of biology in this episode. Your thoughts, Mohamed? Had you noticed?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts.
You noticed that, huh?
I did. It's fantastic. Yay, science.
Well, explain it to me then.
Oh, we can start at the top.
47-point PowerPoint presentation.
Oh, yeah. I have that ready. Let me load that up. No, just kidding.
Yeah, Mohamed, I'm sure you were watching the episode, oh, this is great. And understanding what was happening. And I was just waiting for the story to move. I was like, all right, guys, come on, let's go. I already did this class, and I don't remember having this class.
By the way, everybody, very quickly, this entire season is sponsored by our good friend, Grandpa One, a.k.a. Tim Baum. Thank you, Tim. So sorry to interrupt you, Cirroc. Please continue.
Yeah, so I'm curious to see how, you perceive the episode and what you take out of it as far as the science,
Sure.
Mohamed.
Sure. So I actually have so many thoughts. I'll start with some, but then feel free to just stop me because otherwise I'll just yammer on for the whole 45 minutes. So it's what I liked about this show is that it looked at forms of life that are not just humanoids with a weird prosthetic, which actually Ryan may remember actually at the Vegas convention last year, I made a comment about so much of Trek being humanoids with a funny prosthetic, and John Billingsley was in the back row and said, "There's nothing wrong with humanoids with a prosthetic."
Yeah, good old John. But he's quiet usually.
Yeah, he never speaks.
Doesn't have an opinion.
Yeah. Well, I loved that aspect to it, that it was something that was completely not humanoid. I loved that it was not carbon based. So, Cirroc, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned something about how the word inorganic caught you. So the word organic, we tend to think of as meaning involving life, but actually in a chemical sense, organic only means carbon based. Right. So if you have a lot of chemicals, a lot of compounds that don't have carbon as the main backbone, like carbon hydrogen bonds, then they are considered inorganic. So they could be metallic or they could be silicon based or something like that. Now for us, our proteins,
is chalk organic or charcoal? Aren't those carbon?
Yeah. I guess you would call charcoal organic, I guess, in a sense, right? Because it's basically, it's essentially most of what you see as charcoal is probably burned up dinosaurs or whatever.
Right.
So it kind of is.
Yeah.
But what was I saying about that? Sorry, I lost my train of thought of what I was saying right then.
You were telling me how organic equals carbon based, basically.
Exactly. Yes. So carbohydrates, proteins, fats, all those things have this carbon backbone. It's like carbon hydrogen bonds through most of it. This was really cool because this was actually silicon based. And what was interesting about this, now this is a Trek aspect rather than a science aspect. I'll come back to the science in a second. This is not the first time we've seen a silicon based life form in Star Trek. In the original series, they had this big thing that looked like somebody spilled pizza on a shag carpet, but it was called the Horda.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you remember that. But yeah, that was also silicon based. That's why I thought it was very funny. They're like, that's not possible. Like, did y'all not read what happened on Kirk's Enterprise? Because Kirk already found this. But anyway, that was cool. Well, an aspect which I thought was really interesting was just trying to think of what might we see? And this is something that's a big part of science. What might we see if we go to some other world, right? We tend to assume that we're going to go someplace where we're going to see something that looks a lot like us, but we could see something that is so radically different from us that it's not even clear that it's alive. Now, what some scholars say is they say that we should actually be really careful about how we define life. And I think Beverly made this comment about life as things that I wrote down what she said. They assimilate, respirate, reproduce, grow and develop, move, secrete, excrete. So this whole list of characteristics.
Yeah, and I had a lot of questions about that, but please continue, because that
Sure.
especially move.
Yeah, there's exceptions to almost all of them. So like reproduce, let's just use that as an example. Mules are not dead. They're alive. I mean, they're not, not
Good
being
point.
living forms, right? So I mean, there's examples to, or counterexamples to a lot of those specific things. Now, what some scholars argue is that we should actually come up with a better definition of life. I'm going to actually take a weird stance and say, I don't think we can. I think we just need to go out there and just look and see what's out there before we actually decide how we're going to define life. Because all life that we see on our planet has one single origin. Everything on Earth is actually related, and like truly related in the sense that like we share common ancestors with everything there. So let me illustrate this with an example. Imagine you were to go someplace and somebody was to say, define a game. And you were to go there and you had only ever seen in your whole life, say Monopoly, and maybe some games that were just like Monopoly. You would define a game in that sense as something where a lot of people sit around a table, there's dice, there's little cards, it's competitive, one person wins. And you're like, okay, that's the definition of a game. You go someplace else, you see Settlers of Catan. Yeah, all the same criteria apply, great. Okay, so you feel confident about this. But let's say you went and you found somebody playing solitaire. It doesn't fit most of those criteria. Yeah, dominoes, another example. Or let's go crazy. What if you see somebody playing rugby? So it's interesting because we think we know what life is, but really we just know Earth life. And we may see other things where we just decide a lot of the criteria we're using don't actually matter nearly as much as we thought they did, because they're unique to Earth life, but we're actually interested in something else. We don't know what we're interested in because we don't know what's possible yet. So.
Mm-hmm. So that was an inherent theme in this episode.
Yeah.
Was that they were, trying to come to terms with something that's so outside the box that they didn't think possible. That didn't match the criteria for how they defined life.
And this seems to be a common theme in Star Trek in general. I feel like we've seen a couple of these episodes already just in this season. We've seen it beautifully helped out by Mohamed in Star Trek Discovery, hydrocarbons, if I remember correctly.
Good memory.
But that seek out new life is the motto for the people flying on a spaceship. So that's kind of what they're doing. But Mohamed, I guess you kind of answered the question, because when Beverly, at first she was explaining the things that we the qualifiers that we have to determine whether it's life. And at first I was like, oh, this is great, really interesting. I played it back and then I was like, wait a second, movement, algae doesn't move. I mean, so there are a few things in there, but I guess what you're saying is we should just cut that out completely and just take it on a case-by-case basis.
That's a radical view. I'll say that. I mean, I think there are a lot of exobiologists out there who would strongly disagree with me, and they would say we should actually try to come with a really good definition. I feel like if we're doing that, we're kind of spitting in the wind, because we don't really know. I mean, we'll see things and we won't decide that they're important until we see them often, and we'll say, okay, this is something we actually care about. There's actually a future episode of Star Trek, not this one, where Data has a conversation with Beverly about life, and he actually brings up fire as an example. He says, well, fire can reproduce, right? Because you can have fire and it goes someplace else and it makes more fire as it's going. It's the sustained chemical reaction, which is a lot of what we think of as life. It has a lot of these characteristics, but we've already decided, like, we don't count that. When we see a fire, we're not trying to preserve it because it's a life form or something like that.
All right. Huh.
I kind of was thinking about the different kingdoms of life that we classify, like the animal, plant, bacteria. What would this particular life form that we encounter, what category or classification would that be under, or would we have to make a new one for that?
We would absolutely have to make a new one for that one. That's a great question. We would absolutely have to make a new one for that. And it's interesting because when you have the kingdoms of life, you can actually make this tree of life in terms of how they're related. With this thing, it probably isn't related to us. It's probably something that just arose completely independently from us. So it wouldn't fit any of our kingdoms at all, for sure. No, it's a great question.
And the other thing that kind of stood out to me, Mohammed, was that a lot of the stuff that they were talking about when referring to this life form were actually chemicals that we are familiar with. Like,
That's right.
they mentioned saline water. They mentioned a lot of uh, certain elements that we are used to. So, are those elements that we are used to? Is it the combination of them that makes them something new? Because we're not really dealing with an alternate kind of a different substance that's not on the table of elements, right? We're dealing with stuff that we're familiar with.
Yeah, they're all things we're familiar with. I agree with that. The difference was the silicon basis, because we don't really have silicon as a basis for anything else. So that was the most significant difference from the rest of it. But that does bring up an interesting question, just in the sense of, when we have something like, basically, what are there combinations of chemicals that are much more likely to be associated with life than others? And the answer to that is it often very much depends on the environment. So on Earth, aside from the fact we obviously see the life is carbon-based and it has water as a solvent, it also makes sense. Let's use water as a solvent. It makes sense because water can be in liquid state here in most environments here on Earth. If you were to go someplace where the temperature is a lot colder, having water as a solvent for life doesn't actually make sense. What you might want is something like liquid ammonia or something which is liquid at much colder temperatures. And then you could still have that, basically the chemical reaction still be operating. But it's specific to the environment in which it's found. Now, carbon and silicon, the reason that we tend to see those, carbon is great because if you remember where carbon is on the periodic table of elements, do you remember the periodic table of elements from chemistry?
Who doesn't remember exactly where? Oh boy, I could write the whole thing out right now.
Well, carbon is great because carbon can bind to 4 other atoms, right? Whereas oxygen can only bind to 2. Carbon can bind to 4. So in that sense, you can make really complex things with it. Silicon is right below carbon on the periodic table. So it can also do the same thing. So that's why people have speculated if there was something that wasn't carbon-based, maybe silicon would be good. Now, what this doesn't touch, and this comes back to you just asked, Cirroc, in the context of the saline and things like that, is would silicon work in this environment? The tricky thing is silicon probably wouldn't work great if there's a lot of like water and oxygen, because carbon, again, you can make these sort of carbon-carbon bonds and make the chains of carbon. Silicon can do that as well, but silicon would actually rather bind to like oxygen or hydrogen. So if you put it in water, like it could fall apart. So not an ideal thing. And the original series episode with the Horta, when they had the silicon-based life form, McCoy actually made the comment saying, well, silicon-based life is physiologically impossible, especially in an oxygen atmosphere. So it was interesting that he raised that very specifically back in the original series as a problem with silicon-based life.
But not
my other question,
though. Not impossible. Yeah. Not impossible.
My other question, because this is kind of a thought that went through my head when I was watching the episode, was Data kept making comparisons to this life form and a computer.
Yeah.
Right. And so, is there a connection, for example, with artificial intelligence and the way we're kind of moving in that direction, and this kind of a life form? Is there a similarity there?
So this is a very Star Trek thing, and you'll see as we get to later episodes in this series, that exact thing that you just brought up, Cirroc, that was a brilliant insight. That will come up a lot. Now, I will say Star Trek in general tends to, whenever they find new life, it's almost always new intelligent life. They rarely find like that was the example used earlier, Ryan, of an algae. They don't find this like weird algae and then make a big deal of it. They just kind of move on if they see that. But if it can like talk to them, yeah, right. If it can talk to them, they're all in for it. Now, what's going to happen later in the series, there's going to be a lot of discussion about whether Data is alive and, does he count as life in the context of what you said? And some of these categories will be applied to him. Like, well, does he have physiology? Can he reproduce? Can he do these things? It's touchy in the sense of like, can we count something like that as alive? Ultimately, and people talk like there's this ultimate truth to that question. Like the answer is yes, or the answer is no. The thing is, like, life is just a word. We're going to define it. We can choose how we want to define it. We can choose that we're going to include things like that or not.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But no, it's a brilliant question.
Here's what I want to know from you, Mohamed.
Mm-hmm.
The entire first half of the episode basically was all about terraforming.
Yeah.
We all know that terraforming is basically making something that's uninhabitable into habitable, which I think is still theoretical. I don't know if we've ever done that, not on any kind. Yeah. I mean, we've done it in areas on Earth, I guess, with irrigation or whatever.
Vegas.
Yeah, exactly.
That's true.
100%, exactly.
That's actually a
that.
great example. That's a great example.
But can you kind of walk us through, if you're able to, kind of the stages that they mentioned and the difficulties that may arise?
I don't remember the stages they mentioned, but let's pick a concrete example. Let's say if you wanted to terraform Mars, what would you have to do to make this happen, right? So there's a lot of challenges. I mean, generally speaking, when people talk about this, they say, well, we want to have like an atmosphere where we can breathe or something like that. Because to some extent, if you just have a bubble that you're living in, then what did you terraform? I mean, your terraforming could be you just live in your rocket forever kind of thing. But on Mars, if you were to try to get an atmosphere, the challenge there is it doesn't really work there, because the combination of the low gravity and the absence of a good magnetic field there, Mars can't keep its atmosphere there. So if you were to try to make an atmosphere on Mars, you'd have to just continually add more and more atmosphere all the time. You essentially like have these big tanks that are blowing out or something, and it would keep getting lost. It would keep getting like blown off by solar winds and things like that too. So that's a big challenge. Protection from cosmic rays and other sorts of radiation, because we tend to think of space as being dangerous because it's really cold. That's obviously true, but if you were to be exposed to space for just a very brief time, you're less likely to die from the cold and more likely to die from massive radiation going through your body. Like massive amounts of radiation. Because just for a few seconds, the reason you wouldn't feel super cold really fast is because there's no air there to suck the heat off your body. Right. So you would get cold, but it's just through radiation. There's nothing conducting the heat away from you. So it actually would take, a little bit longer than say the radiation, which is just hitting you right there. So yeah, that's another piece of terraforming. So you want to protect people from this, incredible amounts of radiation that are just being plummeting through there. And then ultimately you want to like set it up where you can actually start growing the foods that we eat and have water that's stable there and create basically an ecosystem. So yeah,
so
it's hard.
Under the conditions that that they were talking about, Dr. Mendel was talking about that they have as requirements for terraforming planets. Is that a possibility under those certain conditions that they were talking about being available?
I didn't write down actually what he said, so I don't remember the specifics. Okay. I remember he said that one of the things they looked for is they made sure that there wasn't already life there because they wanted to make sure not to kill off the life that was there. But I don't remember what he said the other conditions were.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I didn't have them down. I think actually it was mass, gravity, the correct rotation, balance of day and night. Okay. Yeah, those were some of the mathematical, at least, or physics.
Mm-hmm. Those all make sense.
In terms of temperature and environment, they obviously have to start with something that's like sustainable to us or hospitable to us, temperature-wise, because they can't terraform the atmosphere, the temperature, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, those things are interrelated too, because your atmosphere will hold in the temperature. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Spock.
Yeah.
Cirroc, that's actually something I didn't catch. You mentioned mass, gravity, variations in temperature, day and night, right? Or something like that.
Yeah.
Mohamed, can you go over very quickly why those kinds of things are important with tides and with light and dark and all that? Why are those important to creating life?
Yeah, so it's not so much for creating life as it is sustaining life. I don't think the goal for terraforming is to actually just make new life. It's just to make it so that life that's there would be able to survive. Mass is what creates gravity, right? So once you need to have gravity both for the people to exist on there, but also just because that's what's going to hold your atmosphere down on the planet, right? What were the other ones? I forget. There was the day
and night, heat and cold.
Yeah, I think those are. I don't know the answer to that part. My guess is that those two things are probably interrelated. That like if you essentially, let's say you had a planet that was fixed where it was one side was always facing the sun and the other side was always not facing the sun, your temperature difference there is going to be crazy, right?
Right. That's why they mentioned the balance of day and night. I have a question for you, because this was one of the things that came up in the episode that I thought raised a very good question. And the premise was trying to communicate is a sign of intelligent life, right? Because they mentioned that they had found life, but then they said that it tried to communicate, and that was essentially evidence that it was intelligent life. And so that is my question. is the quotient for intelligence communication when we talk about life form?
That's a great question. I don't think there is a universal answer to that question, because that is such a fundamental question right there. Because I mean, a lot of things will communicate. Like when a dog growls at you, it's communicating, right? You know, do we count them as intelligent life? I mean, it depends on if you're a dog lover, I guess.
They are, damn it.
Mine is damn smart. Mine is a damn smart dog. Okay.
Yeah.
Smarter than some people I know.
And they do communicate. I mean, they are communicating. So
100% communicating. Yeah.
And so even on the latest Star Trek, I think it was Discovery, when they were talking about the mycelial network and how the communication of the fungi in that kind of way also works. So they are sticking true to the idea that communicating is intelligent.
Yeah. They're being internally consistent. I'll give them that.
Right.
I think it's one of those things of all A are B, but not all B are A. Like if if something's trying to communicate, it's a sign of intelligent life, but not all intelligent life will be trying to communicate. Because they'd have to have the will to.
It's true.
You know.
Yeah, as long as you keep the
on
sign
Sundays,
up.
I don't try to communicate.
Yeah, it's tricky too, because when we say communicate too, there's a presumed intentionality. Just because we're humans, we tend to think of it as presumed intentionality. But you could imagine something like, let's say that there's a response to a plant that when it's poked a certain way, it flicks. And it's just been something that has just been programmed to do that, because when it did that, it had more seeds, and then when it didn't do that, it had less seeds. So over time, that spread.
Or the coloration of a plant is communicating as well.
Exactly, and most people would not consider that intelligence, right? But they're, like you said, a sign of, I'm good with that, but like an absolute indicator of.
Yeah, it's almost reflective of an intelligent design in its makeup, but not necessarily that the thing itself is intelligent, right?
And this appearance of design tends to come from natural selection, right? Just because if it has a trait and that trait is heritable and it leads to having more kids, that trait will spread, you know, and it ends up over time looking like it's designed when in fact it's just natural selection. Yeah. There was some interesting stuff too that I remember Jordy at one point when he was looking into the place where they got those what do they call them, microbrains or something?
Yeah, it was microbrain is what they call it. I was like, come on.
Crystals, yeah.
Yeah. There was an interesting thing where he made this comment like, there's nothing but basic elements in there. And I was like, what? What does that mean? Because that would not be alive. Because if you're talking about basic elements, it's just the stuff on that periodic table. So it's like, oh, look, there's carbon. Just by itself. Like, yeah, that's not, I don't think there's any way carbon just by itself can be alive. So
speaking of which, a very quick correction. I checked on chalk and charcoal for everybody that's screaming in the live chat about it, I'm sure. So chalk is a compound called calcium carbonate. Molecule of chalk is formed by combination of an atom of calcium, carbon, and oxygen. So I don't know if that makes it carbon-based or if it just has carbon in it. And charcoal, the impure form of graphitic carbon obtained as a residue when carbonaceous material is partially burned or heated with limited access of air. So that was fun.
Speak English.
I know. I'm like, are these words making sense? I'm just reading the words, but they're not entering my brain.
Well,
having PTSD.
One of the things I liked about this life is that it had some things that we don't have, like that it actually. Remember, they could pick up the electrical impulses of us. I mean, that was the thing. Because remember when they stood close to the thing and started glowing.
Like
so
ants.
We can't do that, but sharks can actually do that. They actually have electroreceptors, so they can actually pick up signals from the musculature, just from electrical signals of the musculature of fish nearby. That's part of how they home in and like, oh, there it is, going after it.
Oh shit! So I thought the whole time I could just stay still in the water when the shark was around, but he can still be.
Yeah, you can tell your heart's beating.
He can feel my electricity. Oh shit! I'm gonna be. I'll be flailing now that I know that. I think that's a better option for me.
Is it all skates or just sharks, like rays and stuff?
I'm not sure how broad. I'm pretty sure skates are, but I wouldn't swear to it. I'd look it up and see, but I'm not positive about the answer to that.
Last time I looked something up, I destroyed the conversation. I'm not doing it again. Were you going to say something, Denise?
Oh, I was going to say, and what if dolphins can can kind of scan you with a with a sonar kind of, you can actually feel it in your body.
Oh, wow.
It's really interesting. I mean, if you've ever, I went down to a dolphin research center in Florida and got in with them, and they love children the most, women second, men not so much. And
I don't blame them.
You can hear this, like they kind of scan you. They send out this sonar scan.
Yeah.
See, they can detect if you've got, ailments or you've had surgeries, or according to these researchers. So, I don't know. It's really, I wonder if they can pick up frequencies.
My sister never saw this episode, and yet she came up with the exact same nickname for me. Microbrain.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It must be a.
And if I had a sister, she would call me an ugly bag of mostly water, too. So we're kind of the same boat there.
There it is.
Mohamed, we got to run in just a second here, but I know you had one more thing that you wanted to.
I had one nitpick. I was going to say that this was where Beverly made the comment about the scientific method. And what she said was you observe, theorize, and then attempt to prove it. And this is nitpicky of me, but I did not like that last part, attempt to prove it. Like, no, you test it. That is not the same as attempt to prove, because attempt to prove it means that you are aiming for one result.
There's confirmation bias there.
Exactly.
Ooh,
so yeah, I didn't like that. Yeah.
Oh, very good. Very.
All right, everybody. If you are not way smarter right now than you were 25 minutes ago, you need to listen again. But Mohamed, this was so cool. We really appreciate you, putting lipstick on a pig of this episode. Just kidding. This episode was great. No, but you really made this super fun, and we really appreciate you, man.
Yeah.
I love you guys. Thanks for having me.
Oh, come back. Come back and
love to.
Babysit us again. Walk us
totally entertain us, babysit.
Wow. Explain it all for us. Mohamed explains it all for us.
Actually, everybody go check out Mohamed online. Speaking of explains, where can they find you, Mohamed?
Oh, yeah. On YouTube, I have a series called BioTrekkie Explains. So if you look up BioTrekkie in YouTube, you can actually see a bunch of videos talking about various episodes. Not this one, though. I should make one about this one.
You should.
Yeah, you should.
Or maybe we just did. So it's good.
And you can find him on Twitter at MAF Noor, if I remember correctly, right?
That's correct. Very good. Thank you.
Great. Everybody stick around. We'll be right back. The next segment, we're going to be even smarter. It's going to be so great. We'll be right back on.
No promises.